I'm not a dramatic guy. I don't post rants. I don't pick fights in parking lots. I'm the kind of person who returns the shopping cart and waves first, which is why it still feels unreal to say this out loud. My HOA president stood in my backyard, pointed at my creek like she owned it, and told me, "This is community land now." And when I laughed because I honestly thought it was a joke, she didn't laugh back. She pulled out her phone, started recording, and told her little live stream audience that I was trespassing on HOA property. On my property that I paid for, with my name on the deed. I'm Caleb Hart, 46, and for 15 years I sat behind a desk doing network engineering, long hours, fluorescent lights, meetings that should have been emails. Also, I could someday buy a place where the loudest sound at night was crickets, not traffic. So when I found a 2.5-acre lot in a neighborhood called Magnolia Ridge, just outside Athens, Georgia, I thought I'd finally made it. There was a small creek in the back, a stand of old pines, and a little dip where the ground stayed cool even in July. The listing called it serene. And for once in my life that word didn't feel like marketing. The realtor did mention the HOA, but she said it like it was a weather report. They're strict, but it keeps values up. I read the covenant, did my due diligence, signed, moved in, and for the first year, I was the model neighbor. I landscaped, kept the place clean, even submitted paperwork for a discreet set of solar shingles, which they approved after I basically presented a PowerPoint like I was back at work. Life was good. Then the HOA elected a new president, and everything changed. Her name was Marla Quinn. She moved in 3 streets over, but she showed up everywhere like she was the mayor. Always in white sneakers that somehow never got dirty, always holding a binder like it was holy scripture. First meeting she runs, she's up there smiling too big, saying Magnolia Ridge is ready for the next level. And she clicks a slideshow titled Community Enhancement Vision. That's when I saw it. A map of the neighborhood with bright green highlights. Walking paths, picnic spots, a connected lifestyle. And then she zooms in, and there it is, my property, highlighted like a target. The creek line, the pines, the exact spot I drink coffee every morning, labeled Phase 1 Greenway Connector. I raised my hand, because honestly I thought there had to be a mistake. "Sorry," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "That area is my backyard." Marla smiled at me like I was adorable. "It's currently underutilized," she said, like she was talking about an empty lot, not my home. I blinked. Underutilized by who? The room chuckled a little, and Marla didn't like that. She tapped her binder. "Section 14, subsection C," she said. "The association reserves the right to designate limited common corridors for neighborhood benefit with appropriate compensation." Compensation. Like my backyard was a rental car. I remember looking around for someone to say, "Yeah, no, that's insane." But most people were just nodding, because the words walking trails make folks act like you promised them a better life. I said, "So what's the compensation?" And she says, smooth as butter, "A 15% reduction in annual dues for affected homeowners." I stared at her. "You want a path behind my house so strangers can walk past my kid's bedroom window, and you'll knock a couple $100 off dues?" Her smile tightened. "Residents only, daylight hours, and we'll add signage. It increases property values." I could feel something sour in my stomach, not fear exactly, more like realizing you're standing next to someone who thinks rules are weapons. I said, "I need to talk to an attorney." Marla nodded like she'd already won. "Of course. We'll proceed with preliminary planning in the meantime. Implementation vote next month." Next month. Like I didn't get a say. That night, I went back through the covenant with a highlighter, and there it was, buried in dense language, cross-referenced to another section like a trapdoor. I called my attorney, a guy named Vince Mercer, and he confirmed it. "It's broad," Vince said. "Way broader than usual, but it's there." My heart sank, and then Vince added something that made me sit up. "Broad doesn't mean unlimited," he said. "They still have to comply with county ordinances, safety regulations, and state property law, and they can't just barge onto your land." That last part mattered, because the very next week, little orange flags started appearing along my creek, like someone was marking a crime scene. Then a surveyor showed up one morning, no notice, clipboard in hand, telling me, "HOA authorized boundary marking." I told him politely, "You need to leave," and he left, but I watched him drive away thinking, they're not asking, they're acting. And then came the breaking point. I got home from the grocery store and saw 3 people in my backyard. Marla Quinn, plus 2 board members I'd barely spoken to, standing near my creek, pointing and nodding like they were designing a resort. I walked down the slope, bags in my hands, and said, "What are you doing?" Marla didn't even jump. She turned, smiled, and said, "Oh good, you're home." We were discussing where the footbridge could go. I could feel my face get hot. "You're trespassing," I said. "Leave." She sighed like I was an inconvenience. "We have inspection rights for planning purposes." "Show me," I said. "Show me the clause that lets you enter my land without notice or permission." She didn't. She just said, "This uncooperative attitude isn't helping anyone, Caleb. The Greenway will proceed." And that's when I realized something that hit me like a cold wave. If I didn't put a hard boundary down, they were going to build one for me. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying Marla's tone, the entitlement, the way she said proceed, like she was announcing weather. I've been underestimated before. I'm not a big guy. I drive an old Tacoma. I look like I know how to fix your Wi-Fi and change your oil, not like someone who's going to start a legal war. But I'm also the kind of person who reads fine print. And when you push a person like that into a corner, you don't get fireworks, you get a plan. Next morning, I called Vince and said, "I want to fence the creek line." Vince was quiet for a second. "They'll deny it," he said. "They'll claim it blocks the corridor." I stared out my window at those little orange flags. "Then I need something they can't deny," I said. Vince exhaled. "Okay," he said, "here's a thought. Agricultural use." I laughed. "Because I don't farm, I can barely keep a houseplant alive." Vince said, "Hear me out. Georgia has protections for small agricultural operations, and certain fencing is allowed to protect livestock and pollinators. HOA restrictions can't override state law if you're compliant." "Livestock," I repeated, like I was tasting the word. "What am I supposed to do by a cow?" Vince chuckled. "You don't need a cow," he said. "You need something legitimate. Beehives count. So do certain birds. And if you register properly, you can install protective fencing in the designated area." That's when it clicked. Marla wanted to turn my creek into a neighborhood walkway. Fine. I'd turn that same area into a legally protected agricultural zone. Not fake. Not a gimmick. Real enough to stand up in court. The next week was chaos. I filed the paperwork to designate part of my property as a small apiary operation. I found a local beekeeper named Sandra who talked fast and knew everything. She came over, walked my yard, and said, "That creek line is perfect. Good water source. Lots of forage." Then she looked at me and grinned. "You got HOA trouble, don't you?" I didn't even have to answer. I ordered 2 hives and a starter package, and while I was at it, I bought a small quail coop, because apparently quail count as livestock in the eyes of the county and they're quiet. And honestly, if you've never heard a quail chirp in the evening, it's kind of soothing. Then I called a fencing contractor who specialized in agricultural containment. When the guy came out, he asked what I wanted, and I said, "I want something legal, safe, and very, very persuasive." He smiled like he understood the assignment. We installed a solar-powered electric fence, the kind designed for livestock, low amperage, not dangerous, but enough to make you rethink your choices. And we did it clean, neat posts, tidy lines, yellow warning signs every 15 feet that read caution, electric fence, agricultural area, and no trespassing. It cost me more than I wanted to spend, around 18 grand all in. And while the crew was working, I kept thinking, I cannot believe I'm paying this much money because a woman with a binder thinks my creek is underutilized. The fence went up 3 days before the HOA vote. And that same afternoon, my doorbell rang. I opened the door, and there was Marla, flanked by 2 board members like she was walking into court. Her face was red, but her voice was syrupy. "Caleb," she said, "what is this?" I leaned on the doorframe and said, "A fence." She stepped forward, eyes wide. "An electric fence," she snapped, like I'd installed a moat with alligators. "Without HOA approval." I smiled, not because I was being smug, but because for the first time in weeks, I felt my spine straighten. "It's for my apiary," I said. "And my birds." "Bees," she said, like the word offended her. "Quail," I added, holding up a folder. "Here's the registration, permits, citations, and installation specs. It meets county code. State law allows protective fencing for agricultural operations." Marla flipped through the papers, and you could see her brain trying to find a lever to pull. This is clearly a stunt, she hissed, to sabotage the community greenway. I put on my most innocent face and said, Marla, I've discovered a passion for sustainable living. Honey, eggs. It's wholesome. One of the board members behind her almost laughed, caught himself. Marla's eyes narrowed. This fence is a hazard and an eyesore, she said. The board will not approve it. Good thing you don't have to, I said, still calm. Anyone who ignores those warning signs and touches it, that's on them. We'll see about that, she snapped, spinning on her heel and marching off like her sneakers weren't expensive. The next day I got a cease and desist from the HOA's attorney. Vince read it and literally chuckled. They're bluffing, he said. They know the exemption is solid. This is intimidation. We responded with a letter twice as long, politely explaining the legal basis and reminding them that interfering with protected agricultural operations could expose them to penalties. The HOA vote night was uncomfortable. Marla stood up, clicked her little map, and my property was no longer highlighted. She didn't explain it. She didn't apologize. She just acted like it never happened, but I saw the looks in the room. People whispering. People realizing maybe this vision wasn't as cute as it sounded. During open comments, I raised my hand. Marla looked like she was chewing glass as she acknowledged me. I stood and said, if anyone wants to learn about beekeeping, I'm doing a short demonstration this Saturday. It's actually pretty fascinating. Just please use the front gate. The agricultural fence is for your protection. A couple people smiled. A few even asked questions. Marla stared at me like I'd insulted her bloodline. The first incident happened about 2 weeks later. My camera caught 2 HOA board members walking up to the fence line with a stick, poking it like they were testing a myth. When nothing happened, one of them reached out and touched the wire. The yelp he let out. I shouldn't laugh, but I did. It wasn't harmful, just startling, like karma with a tiny battery. He jumped back, shaking his hand, and the other guy said something I couldn't hear, but his body language screamed, "We're idiots." The second incident made me angrier. I came home to find Marla standing near my electrical box with a man in a city uniform. She looked pleased with herself. "We received reports of an unsafe installation," she said. The inspector, a tired guy named Roland, looked confused. I said, "Sir, she didn't tell you it's a permitted agricultural fence, did she?" Roland blinked, checked his clipboard, and you could see the moment he realized he'd been used. I showed him the permits, the contractor documentation, the safety signage requirements, everything. He nodded, walked the line, and finally said, "This is up to code." Marla's face tightened. Roland turned to her and said, "Ma'am, next time, give accurate information. Misrepresenting complaints wastes city resources." And he left. Marla stayed, arms crossed, like a kid who didn't get the toy she wanted. "This isn't over," she said quietly. I looked at her and said, "It can be, if you stop." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Standards matter," she said, and walked away. Here's what I didn't expect. My little stand didn't just protect my yard, it woke people up. Neighbors started calling me privately, asking, "How did you do the agricultural thing? And is it true the HOA can just take land?" One guy admitted he'd voted for Marla because he liked the idea of trails, but now he was nervous. Another woman said she'd been fined for decorative lighting visibility, whatever that meant, and she was tired. The neighborhood split, not into screaming factions, more like quiet lines. Folks who wanted a picture-perfect community, and folks who realized picture-perfect turns ugly when it's forced. 3 months later at the quarterly meeting, attendance was higher than I'd ever seen. Marla tried to introduce Phase 2 of her Greenway initiative, targeting different backyards now that mine was fenced. She started her speech, "Premium developments require amenities." And that's when something beautiful happened. A board member named Tessa, someone who'd barely spoken all year, raised her hand and said, "Before we proceed, I move we review the legal basis for designating private property as common use." The room went still. Marla stared at her. "Excuse me." Tessa swallowed, then said louder, "Legal expenses have increased. Residents are concerned. We should focus on actual HOA-owned land instead of taking pieces of our neighbors' yards." Murmurs of agreement rolled across the room. Another homeowner stood up and said, "We own that 3-acre parcel by the entrance. It's been nothing but a sign and weeds for 10 years. Why aren't we developing that instead?" That suggestion hit like a match in dry grass. People nodded. Someone clapped. Marla tried to steer it back, but you could tell her grip was slipping. The vote passed to suspend the initiative and form a committee to explore options using existing common areas. Marla sat down slowly, like she'd been unplugged. She stayed president through the end of her term, but 6 months later, she wasn't re-elected. The new president was a retired high school principal named Don Avery, the kind of man who listens more than he talks. First thing Don did was propose a revision to that limited corridor clause, requiring explicit homeowner consent and fair market compensation for any private land use. The irony wasn't lost on me. Marla's overreach ended up creating stronger protections for everyone. Meanwhile, my bees were thriving. I'm not even kidding, I actually started to love it. The first time Sandra handed me a jar of honey from my own hives, warm in the sun, I felt this quiet pride that had nothing to do with winning. The quail turned out to be oddly charming, and my yard, the one Marla called underutilized, was suddenly full of life. Marla eventually sold her house. I heard she moved to a newer development with better community alignment, which is a nice way of saying she went somewhere people like being controlled. On the day she left, I stood by the fence line, listened to the hum of the charger, and felt not triumphant, not exactly. Mostly tired. Because here's the thing about standing up to someone like that. You win, but you pay for it. Stress, time, money, sleep. And there are still neighbors who think I was selfish, that I should have compromised, that a trail would have been nice. Maybe they're right. Maybe in a perfect world, a trail is harmless. But I don't live in a perfect world. I live in one where a person with a binder tried to rewrite my property line with a PowerPoint. Now let me tell you the part that's going to make some people mad. I never took the fence down, even after the HOA backed off, even after the covenant got revised. Because the fence stopped being just a defense, it became a boundary I needed for my own peace. And yeah, sometimes I wonder if that makes me part of the problem. If putting up a hard line teaches everyone to build walls instead of talking. But then I remember Marla standing in my backyard like she owned it, and I think, no, some lines are supposed to be hard. Last month, a plain white envelope showed up in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a printed photo of my fence warning sign, taken from the road, with 4 words typed underneath, still watching. Standards matter. I taped it above my workbench, right next to the first jar of honey I ever harvested. Not because I'm scared, but because it's a reminder. There's always another Marla somewhere, another person who thinks community means control, and if you don't set boundaries early, you'll spend a fortune setting them later. So here's my question for you, and I genuinely want to hear it. Was I right to fight back the way I did, to outplay the HOA with a legal loophole and a fence that literally shocks people who cross the line? Or should I have taken a softer route, tried to negotiate, maybe even let the greenway happen for the sake of the neighborhood? Where's the line between being a good neighbor and protecting what's yours, and how much should appearances matter compared to basic property rights? Drop your take in the comments. And if you've ever dealt with an HOA, or a boss, or anybody who tried to claim pieces of your life like they owned them, tell your story too. Because I swear, the world is full of quiet people and old trucks. And the only reason bullies keep winning is because nobody talks about what they do in broad daylight.